necessarily better than the other. It's just good to have them all, because sometimes, you know, one works better than the other. There are also several manuscript palm leaf versions of the Yukti Bhasha that are digitized and available online. So I've looked at some of those as well, and they've been helpful too in terms of, you know, really nailing down a word, because sometimes it's the printed edition doesn't make total sense. And the thing with the Yukti Bhasha, I think, is because it was such a popular manuscript, there's a popular book, there are so many manuscripts floating around. So I don't know if there is, I mean, this is, I suppose, the critical edition, but I don't think it's the last word on the subject, because there are some of the other versions which I think are better in places.
We are so, you know, there's so much left to be done on the prosopography of the entire textual tradition in, you know, Sanskrit and related languages, their scientific texts. I mean, compared to things that are known in other traditions about, you know, who wrote something, who studied with whom, who got this copy from where. And so, and in Keshav, in your case, I know that when you are looking to analyze data from manuscript tables visually, not visually, but digitally, then, you know, that further raises the stakes on readings. You know, are there, you know, we're not looking for a digital humanities magic bullet solution to these problems, but are there techniques that you feel, you know, some statistical analyses, at least of numerical data, that help resolve this question of, you know, the potential corruption of manuscripts? Like, how can we know what was intended to be written or what was part of the text versus something that just crept in the textual process?
Yeah, so as per my understanding is, of course, you find variant readings or maybe even mistakes by the copiers, and after digitization you will find a pattern of mistakes. Sometimes we don't even find a pattern, but for example, especially when you round up the last values, so one copier or one scribe has a technique, another might have another technique, because these tables are meant for your you know, immediate practice, immediate use. So I don't know whether, I mean, if you have siddhantas or karanas, yes, you can use the algorithms, they're like formulas, but the tables, they are meant for a certain period. So especially in rounding off the values, you might see some variance, and also you find some silly mistakes. So when they're copying, the 5 might look like 2. So these are very obvious mistakes that we find.
Professor, can I just interrupt that Dr. Andrea has joined the session?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Welcome. Please, you know, jump in.
Yeah, by the way, we have Andrea here.
Yes,
Andrea. So,
hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we
can.
You
can hear.
We've just been carrying on the discussion very merrily, but we would love to get your 2-minute introduction to your contribution as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
My apologies. There's always some technical glitch with these things. Yesterday I was in sessions without a problem, but on stage it's different. If you've had a chance to see the video to go along with the paper, I take a more expansive view of the sciences, of Laukika Shastra or Vijnana in a more worldly sense of knowledge, and work on culinary science, Pakashastra, which often for compilations gets put together with astrology and water divination and agriculture and a lot of these other practical sciences that have uses on the ground. And so so a couple of the other culinary recipe collections I work with do appear alongside other types of scientific material. the text that I presented on for this conference, the Pakadarpana, is purely a cookbook. Yeah. And since we have so much of an astrological focus, astronomical focus here, honestly, there's not a lot of astrology in this text, except for the fact that for some reason the author puts Nala in the Chandra Vamsha, when in the Mahabharata he's a Surya Vamsha guy, right? And so the author, either gets this wrong accidentally, or maybe it's deliberate and it's a reference to the king and the court where he was actually composing. For some time, I tried to use that little snippet as a clue, like, this is wrong, something's wrong here, because everybody knows the Mahabharata, right? And so maybe this is a hint. He's alluding to the king he's writing this for. And I tried going down that literally rabbit hole for a long time, but I still don't have enough information to try to work out which sort of court or kingdom this text was composed in. But it's this roughly the same time, 12th to 15th century, when a lot of these other Laukika Shastras were really being brought to the fore. And so the big feature of this paper was that I've uncovered missing verses, missing shlokas from the Pakadarpana in a later collection, right? In the Shivatattva Ratnakara of Basavaraja, who does write about all kinds of other sciences in his teachings to his son, the prince. And so there are simple recipes for buttermilk and cooking there you do see, because you have a whole, one of the whole parichedas is a section on Dharma related to food, and there you'll see a lot of this, what you should eat at certain times of day, and not presented as Ayurvedic knowledge, but as the right thing to do. Again,
Right.
I don't know if this answers your question. It's not presented terribly astrologically, except with the seasons. You do get this, you know, the set of 6 seasons and things to eat at each time. Even in the Pakadarpana, you get this, but just a little bit, a few verses. It's not very heavy-handed.
I see. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
I have a question for Andrea as well, if I may. This has to do with the reference in your article about the puga patra leaf that's used for wrapping and serving the food. And I was just wondering, based on your reading of other culinary texts, the Manasollasa and Shiva Tattva, Shiva Tattva Ratnakara, right? Whether, is it the same? The puga referring to the arecanut leaf, right? So is it the same leaf that's used for wrapping food across texts? Is that the standard choice? And whether you might know of any reason for that? Is there any kind of medicinal property to it, or is it just, you know, the one that stands up the best? I was just curious about that choice.
So I think I explained in the video, but it may not have come across well, that actually that is how I was able to find these missing pieces and identify them as belonging to the Pakadarpana, because it is the only cookbook that talks about puga and puga parta in cooking. Of the cookbooks that I've read as Sanskrit cookbooks, which I think is most of them, although I haven't read snippets of all of the manuscript fragments from other texts, like from Nepal. I have those manuscripts, I haven't read them. And so what we have in the Shiva Tattva Ratnakara mentioning Puga Parta, I was like, this has to be from the Nalapaka because it's the only time I've seen this, right? And I don't know 100% if this is areca or if this is a betel leaf, right? I mean, it ought to be areca, but it sounds like the cook is wrapping it on the spot, and you really have to heat it a lot and keep it soaking to do that. You can press it and prep ahead of time and have it dried and done for bowls and plates and so on. And so that's why, and also in this cookbook, the Nalapaka Nala says, because he's the master chef, he says you want to use puga pata because it's so nice and fragrant, because it has this fragrant aromatic quality, and it keeps bugs away. And I feel like betel leaf is more fragrant and aromatic than areca, right? But mostly going off this thing of, if you actually have to wrap and seal fully and fold it on the spot, you would have to have a lot of very hot, you'd be doing a lot of folding work, which of course is still possible in a palace kitchen, and is possible, of course, for steaming, but a little harder to conceive of. So I haven't decided fully one way or another, and I would love if anyone has further insights, because you don't see this attested in very many other places. Yeah, that's why it's so unusual. And actually, that's what the king comments. He asks Nala, he says, how is this possible? Why would you use pugaparta when you have gold and silver vessels, right? He makes a point about this, of like, why would you cook with this for the king, right? When of course we see many traditional foods in India cooked in leaves. That's the standard, right? And you find all of the Dharma Shastras mention this, all of the different materials that can be used for cooking and serving that are plant leaves. So still looking for help if anyone has ideas.
Oh, look out for that. Now, I'm going to jump in now with a couple of questions from audience members. We've got Taro Tokutake at Kyoto University in Japan, having 2 questions for Priyambada. I worry, I don't think I see Brunda at present, so I have emailed our tech support just to make sure that she hasn't been lost. But Mr. Tokutake's questions are, is the Ganata Yukti Bhasha the first text to mention the calculation of Varga Yoga Mula, the square root of the sum of squares, and Vargantara Mula, square root of the difference? And second, are there any texts other than the Ganata Yukta Bhasha that deal with these calculations?
This is, oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Now I hear you.
Yeah, it's certainly not the only text. In fact, this is a very common procedure that's used for astronomical purposes. So it's dealt with by a variety of texts, and they may not all use the same procedure. Each one, they can come up with their own. Other texts besides the Ganita Yukti Bhasha that deal with this, there's the Kriya Kramakari, of course, the Yukti Deepika. There is the Sanskrit version of the Yukti Bhasha, which is fairly close, but not entirely a replica. So it does exist in other texts. I wouldn't say that that the procedure itself is unique here. Although this particular process, and that's something that I still need to do, whether how this compares with the process in the Kriya Kramakari and other texts, I need to do that comparison. So I do know that the square root of the sum of squares and difference of squares is definitely addressed in other books, but whether it is the same exact method, I need to look into that. What is definitely unique about the Yukti Bhasha, though, is its treatment of infinite series and the explanation of the rationale. That is the first time we see that topic explained in detail in the well, really in all of Indian mathematics, I guess, although it seems to be sort of implicit or implied in the Tantra Sangraha. And maybe, we can only theorize that it may have been known to earlier mathematicians, because this is not presented necessarily as something unique or original. It's presented in a way that's explaining an earlier treatise. But it's definitely the treatment of infinite series is definitely what is unique to the Yukti Bhasha.
I have to follow that up with a question of my own. Sorry about that. There is a question for Andrea that an audience member has asked, and I will honor that. But I just have to know on this the question of classification of topics, not just what texts treat what subject, but what they consider it. Would you say that this is bija? These techniques, are they considered algebra, in the sense that algebra is a nice neatly delineated topic within Ganita? Is it Shredi, another series, another mathematical topic? I mean, do authors and commentators, in your experience, talk about how to classify these things taxonomically? Or is it all just Ganita, the Yukti Bhasha of Ganita?
I think, well, in this case, it's definitely, the approach seems to me to be more geometrical than, because the framework that he's using is more of a geometrical approach. But it's not to say that he may not have been aware of an algebraic approach. It seems to me that these were all available as a sort of, that they were known to practitioners of mathematics, and these individuals picked what made sense to them. So he may have, the fact that he used a geometric approach here doesn't mean that he would not have used an algebraic approach somewhere else. I don't see, in terms of a taxonomical, clearly defined, but maybe I've not looked carefully enough. I mean, I've been reading a couple of texts very closely, but I haven't read a broad enough spread. So I'm not entirely sure about whether that is even discussed at length anywhere in the literature.
It may be, and this is something that I'd like to get the Keshav's view on it, that this mathematical taxonomy that we see in the textbooks, things like the Lilavati and Bijaganita, these might just be nice, neat classifications that you use for teaching students. And then when it comes to, figuring things out yourself as a professional practitioner, it's all up for grabs. You don't need to, sort these things out. Keshav, do you have any remarks on that or follow up to the?
Yeah. Just a remark that while I studied Nyaya Shastra or Vyakarana Shastra, grammar, there you see classifications and you have a great commentary tradition. So there they also discuss in detail why such classification. Okay, for example, if you say take Tarka Sangraha, so they talk about Dravya, Guna, Karma, Samanya, etc. And why Dravya is Dravya, they define. And they also define the very definition of Dravya. So like Lakshana and Lakshana is Lakshana. So they have so many layered commentaries which give some distinction for every category. I studied Lilavati and other texts, so you don't find such classification, or rather you say the justification for the classification. So then that's my observation.
Yeah, it would be nice if we could get taxonomy there. Brenda, yes. Welcome back. Yeah. Now I want to make sure that we get the question from Christiane Weisbach-Berger for Andrea. What made you choose the culinary field? I find this highly interesting. Actually, I'd like to get that question answered by all the speakers here, because I think that often leads to very interesting, profound discussions. It's like, well, how do we get this way?
Everyone has idiosyncrasies, right? We have our passions. And even as a child, I would read cookbooks obsessively from cover to cover, which is really not how you're supposed to read the cookbooks, I guess. I mean, you can. And so when you find ones that tell stories like Nalapakadarpana does, actually has a narrative and dialogue, it's so exciting and rare, really is a unique piece for cookbooks from India. Some of the others, I think of the Nimatnama of the Sultan of Mandu, where you have this gorgeous cookbook, but it doesn't tell a story. It's not like, it doesn't have a narrative, right? Yeah, mostly just obsession with, this is something a lot of people have. I think watching, you have your master chefs, celebrity chefs you like to watch. Well, mostly for me, it's words and books. So just reading the recipe is a whole story, a process and a procedure in itself, right? And for the pre-modern early recipes, there's a lot missing. You often don't have a name for the dish. You have to guess that and figure it out, or you have to guess the procedure. You'll have the ingredients, or sometimes you won't have the measurements. Sometimes we do. That's really nice, but rare. So mostly that sort of fascination. And of course, I mean, who doesn't love all of the variants of various communities of Indian cuisines and subcontinental cuisines, and try to figure out the history for that, which is sadly has been neglected. I still look through even just things like jatakas and look through, and really, because that really for the food words, they get translated pretty poorly in a lot of the older editions, older translations. What dish is actually being described? It's like sour, it's sweet and sour so often in the jatakas. What are they describing? Try to figure it out, or reading the poetry also, and really discerning what foods were being eaten. So there's a lot of work there for me and others, hopefully.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions that panelists have for each other? I'm checking on additional audience questions, and so far so good. But yes.
Could I perhaps ask Priyamvada? Thinking through how you've discussed sort of the rationale for what gets included and what gets excluded, right? This is something that's explicit, that the author presents at the very beginning of the work or the beginning of each section, or this is your interpretation, sort of your meta analysis of how or if the author is giving a rationale for what is included or what gets left out. It wasn't quite clear to me. Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the list of about 7 chapter headings, kind of, right? On one of the slides. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, just thinking about sort of what topics get included, because I also face this in my work and probably many others. When you're reading through whatever piece of Indian writing or scholarship, some things that editor or writer really focuses on, and some topics are left out, you know, and the choice sometimes is not obvious and you have to interpret. It wasn't clear for me reading if this is something that the author had addressed, or if you yourself just figured out that whether it was through the proofs that it was logically a logical topic to include. Does that, I'm not sure.
He does. Yeah, he does say at some point that he's writing this text as a commentary on an earlier text, which provides procedures, but not necessarily the explanation for that. So in the process of doing that, he's also bringing in other supporting procedures and methods to aid his explanation. So that seems to drive his choice of what he decides to include. And he starts from the very basics of addition, subtraction, which, when you see a book start that way, you automatically assume that this is some kind of a primer. But then it's not an A to Z of mathematics. It's, he starts from the very basics with everything that you need to understand the book that he is explaining. So procedures that may be simple or complex, if they don't, and that's why he leaves out things like cubes and cube roots, because they don't come in this context of explaining the methods of the Tantra Sangraha. But those were definitely known to him, and they have been discussed in other earlier texts, but he just chooses not to discuss it. I hope that makes sense.
Right, so reasons of clarity about that himself, right? Or clarifying or elucidating topics that are still kind of in the dark, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are, like I mentioned earlier, there are some of the topics that he mentions have never been addressed. The topic of infinite series has never been addressed the way it has been in this book, in any other Indian mathematical work. So that is definitely, from our point of view, something original. But even that is presented in the book as an explanatory kind of aid to something that has already been expressed in an earlier work. So there's there is material that we would consider original, but sounds like this was just known to at least a couple of generations beforehand, and there's material that we know for sure existed for centuries earlier, but which he has chosen not to include because it's not relevant for his purpose. It's a very mixed kind of bag, and probably not totally satisfying for our point of view, but that's pretty much how it is.
We do have another audience question briefly that Christiane Weisbach-Berger said, thank you, that is fascinating, and she loves to read cookbooks too, as do we all, I think. There's a question I'd like to ask to go around the panel as we end with, but first, Barbara Nelson would like to ask Andrea, do you try the recipes? I had an Akkadian professor, Alice Slotsky at Brown, who gave Mesopotamian feasts to Akkadian students every year. Had cuneiform clay tablet recipes from about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and tried to approximate the ingredients and cook them up. What's your experience with that?
Yes, I do try. Of course, I'm vegetarian, so I don't cook it all, especially for manasalasa. We have so much meat in there that I have not attempted, but I've attempted vegetarian recipes from the manasalasa and nalapakadarpana. And honestly, so manasalasa is dates to pretty much pretty tightly to 1131 CE, 12th century, right? Chalukyan material. And it's very replicable to try to produce these dishes, right? Even though it doesn't have a lot of detail. Sometimes, of course, it may be familiar because you already know what dosa is, even if this one might be kind of different, right? We have some referent, or, idli. The idli are these sort of more hand-pressed kind that you'll steam that are made of dal, no rice. But in the masalasa, it's so easy to figure it out. A couple times it's hard, where it's something that's a little, most of the time though, I have a good sense of what's going on, or it takes a little bit more thinking. But and in the Pakadarpana, oftentimes I'm not quite sure what the dish is supposed to be like. And this is what suggests to me that I think the received text that we have, that I think is correctly to say is 12th to 15th century, has a lot of content that's earlier. Yeah, a lot of Pakashastra content that's earlier, because some of these recipes are very, very unfamiliar, right? And I can't even decide, is this one supposed to be kind of more like kind of what you might call a dry curry or more gravy type dish? Like sometimes I really can't tell,
It's
And
true that the sources, I think that across the board for all sources, what comes out of a Sanskrit text as the immediate author's own contribution and what is reflecting a much longer tradition is, often pretty impenetrable. I would like, if people don't mind, to just go around the panel and ask everybody to, give 1 minute to your same of the same question, the follow up with a bearing on that. If you could know, start with Keshav. If you could know one thing about the source text you're working on that you just don't, if you can get one, crystal of historical information about it, what would that be?
Well, it's an interesting question. Um, I'm working on Jagat Bhushana. So you find that he introduced this idea of chakras, and none of other authors used it. And we don't have any commentary because I'm the first researcher working extensively on this. So if there was a hint why he used it, because ultimately you arrive at the same almanac, but why he used a technique and why he didn't just follow other tradition. So if you give certain hints somewhere in the verses or even small commentaries, that will be very enlightening, because for now we are just finding out why and how and what is the legacy, and so we don't know the sources, we don't know why he employed. So if I know this, that will be much
That's a
insightful.
very modest wish. I hope you get it. But how about you, Vrunda? I mean, is there something like one manuscript, one reading, one something that you would just like to know that you don't know? I mean, we'd all like to know everything, but if you had to have just one, what would you pick?
Ma'am, once more, I can't hear my so I can't hear
Oh,
properly.
I was asking if there was, is this better? Can you hear this better?
Yes, yes.
Is that better? I was asking if there was one thing you could know about the sources that you're working on, one manuscript or something, some historical information that you don't have that you think would really make a big difference. What would that one thing be?
Any new that just I found during my unique thing I found that you any unique thing?
Or something that you would like to know that you don't. We're just sort of making wish lists here for something that, you know, if you could find some piece of information, you know, kind of magically presented to you, what would you like?
During my research, I have a thought about that. I have to make a new edition of Leelavadi. Based on the Sanskrit commentaries and the Malayalam commentaries. I have a plan. That's the unique thing I have find in Kerala tradition. We can find numerous different readings to the text Leelavadi. So I have a plan about that.
Good. Yeah, so that is a wish that, yeah, you might actually get, depending on, you know, what you do. How about you, Priyanka? Are there
I think for me, one of the things I wish I had a clear idea about is why the Yuki Bhasha was written in Malayalam, because it had so many original things to say, and why, you know, it did not choose to be part of this pan-Indian, you know, conversation in the Sanskrit cosmopolis, but restricted itself to this vernacular audience. I think
identified itself as, yeah, I mean, it's a basha, you know, it's coming right out there and saying, you know, this is a vernacular treatment.
but the Tantra Sangraha is in Sanskrit, and it chooses to, you know, explain that by just, you know, to a very restricted regional audience, which I think has very interesting social and historical implications. Maybe it suggests that, you know, there was a wide enough interest in the vernacular, or, you know, a certain level of education that this made sense. And I think all of those are questions that really need to be looked into. But it's a very mystifying question for me.
Yeah, that is fascinating. How about you, Andrea? I mean, some ingredients, some manuscripts, some
I think actually just as basic as if I knew the kingdom that the Nalapaka Darpana was composed in, I would, it's not that I would sleep more at night, but it would be such a relief, you know, to be able to place it, because already that gives you a small range of time and a geographic location, much more specific, right? And my issue is, yeah, I've been trying to do it lexically, right? When I found a couple of words that pretty much seem Dravidian, right? You only have them in Kannada or Telugu. And, but I'm still, some of the things feel kind of northern, or what might be things that today are kind of called, what are more commonly called in Urdu circles are kind of more, either more Muslim type dishes. So I'm really kind of, for a while I was like, maybe this is a, you know, it's a Hindu kingdom in what was otherwise a Muslim area or something. I don't know. I have all these speculations. I wish I knew. More work has to be done.
I think we all share that. Yeah. Well, we are getting the notification that we have less than 2 minutes left in our session. And, you know, I just want to make sure I have time to thank all the panelists for participating, all of the audience members who sent us questions. I am just, you know, just checking now to make sure. I think I have now asked all the questions that were sent